and we started collecting. We also found a relationship with the State Library as well as the museum to share our material with them, to make sure that we were represented in mainstream institutions as well. The languages that are included in the oral histories range from English, Italian, various dialects, combinations of all three, and what I've termed Italianised versions of English words, which makes it a challenge about transcribing this material. An oral history, as you know from Italian dialects, there are over 30 recognised dialects throughout Italy. So this makes these oral histories authentic in the fact that they're being told in their unique language. Now, many of the dialects are considered as actual languages as well, so that makes it special, but as you can imagine, it also makes it a challenge for transcribing this material as well, but it does give that uniqueness to them. We use our oral histories within our publications and research undertaken by other groups, but a lot of the material has been used in our own publications, which has been a wonderful way of promoting these stories out into the community, which otherwise they would not have been used in any other way. With the use of the oral histories, we're also using them in our Museo Italiano, and also some of our more recent digital stories are found within our Museo Italiano. We've been able to convert our experience within the museo proper as a virtual tour. And the important thing about these stories that we have, we've got them in the original language, but we also have the English translations of everything that we have. So we've got two communities, definitely, that we can share these stories with, which has been important. There's not many institutions in Australia that have multiple languages when it comes to exhibitions or this sort of promotional information. So within the Museo Italiano, we have 16 digital stories which talk about the contemporary stories. So we've got a context because we've got the original early histories, but we're also incorporating some of the more modern stories, which is really important because otherwise we're stuck in the past, and we're showing that this is a continuation. As we all know, there's a very different way of migrating these days, and whether it's permanent or as permanent as it was previously. As I mentioned, we have an international collaboration with MEI here, which has been a wonderful experience for us to share these stories back to Italy. So these voices are heard again, and as well as having them here within MEI, the building, they are also on the MEI website too, which gives it another level of sharing that for people to experience more broadly as well. With our oral histories today, what we're doing is going the other way around. We're actually now using objects to help us with the oral histories and the storytelling. And in this image, we have a lady who'd come out from Italy, and what she's looking at and what she's given to us is her shawl. Now, if you look at that shawl, you would just think, oh, it's a shawl. Once you start talking to her, you find that she actually made it on the ship coming out to Australia. So it has her hopes in there, her fears. So it raises the level of the importance of the object because of that connection with the person, but also it provides a trigger and helps tell these stories. One of the very important things in our oral histories is the fact that they were done by the Italian community with the Italian community, which meant that these stories, the people telling these stories felt safe in telling their histories. It was the insider story that they could tell. There's often talk about the outsider, so you're looking at it from another perspective. So if you're looking at it from, say, from an immigration perspective, you're looking at it from an outsider. When you're looking at the immigration story like this, it's from the insider, but it allows more things to be told. And we had an Oral History Australia conference recently, just before I came here, that we were part of. And they were talking about the Shoah project. We had Alessandro Portelli, who's the key oral historian in the world, who's actually based in Rome, speak. And he was talking about how the stories that he gathered were much more personal stories and more sharing than, say, with the Shoah project. In the Shoah project, which is the project that's going around the world, to be able to collect the stories of Holocaust victims, it's a very structured approach. It's not a bad approach, it's just a structured approach. Whereas the stories that we have were done in a more conversational way, a more relaxed way, so people shared more things. They didn't feel judged. They felt they were supported, which I think makes a difference in many ways too. With our oral histories today, as I mentioned, I was part of the Oral History Australia conference recently, which has been a major shift. It was one of the very first conferences that included multicultural collections in it, so that it's almost like we've come full circle with these stories of identity. So we were creating an identity for ourselves that we were proud to talk about, and it was something we felt was a true identity. But now it's being accepted within Australia and people wanting it to be shared and be part of the mainstream oral history level. It's taken a long time, but it shows you need to be persistent and patient. One other thing that we're actually part of, and I'm involved in too, just to let you know with our oral histories, is we've been invited to be part of two key projects, one for the state of Victoria and one for the national level, to do with the preservation of oral histories and how to share them. So they actually want the input from organisations like the Historical Society, which is a community museum, as part of this bigger discussion in Australia, which is a key thing for us to be recognised in that way. So here I'm just going to let you hear a bit more of these voices.
Giovanna Spagnolo, il 28 maggio 1985. Dunque signora, allora anzitutto mi può dire dove è nata e quando?
Io sono nata a Rozzo il 1 gennaio del 1907.
E Rozzo si trova dove, signora?
Sugli altopiani d'Asiago.
Sarebbe provincia di Vicenza.
Provincia di Vicenza.
Mi dica cosa facevano i suoi genitori per vivere?
Mio papà era un immigrante.
Sì.
Che era in Germania, in America, anche in Francia. La mamma lavorava alla campagna.
Lei aveva fratelli, sorelle? Questa intervista è stata registrata con la signora Giovanna Spagnolo il 28 maggio 1985. Questa intervista è stata registrata con la signora
Grazie. And so you can see with this information some of the themes that are covered just within this story itself, and also the fact that we've got images associated with it as well. We've got various age groups represented in parts of Italy as well.
Io direi che Calton era il ghetto degli italiani dei primi anni quando arrivavano, direi fino al 1970, ma poi basta, insomma, perché dopo naturalmente gli italiani che arrivavano qua avevano appunto, eravamo già noi qua che sapevamo com'era la vita così, e loro si muovevano più, si sono mossi più in fretta di noi. Si apriva il negozio presto la mattina, verso le 8, 8 e mezza, e c'era una confusione.
Great, thank you. So that was the voice of a gentleman who's actually a trader, who's in that local area, who actually worked in the coffee business. And so you have someone who's come out to follow her husband, and then you've got someone who's actually started up a business specifically. And then we have this last interview very quickly, and this is an Italian woman born in 1921, and she's from Naples, so a different area again.
Prima in pensione piangeva tutti i giorni, che pensava ai genitori che aveva lasciato in Italia e qui non c'aveva nessuna compagnia, erano tutti inglesi, dove stava lì erano inglesi, tutti inglesi intorno, il padrone di casa che parlava l'italiano, ma erano lontani da quel posto, venivano una volta alla settimana, una volta ogni tanto, e piangeva sempre. E mio marito lavorava a queste pompe, dove ti dico, lì, prima in pensione piangeva tutti.
Thank you. So, just in summary, I've just listed some of the challenges, rewards and responsibilities in working with these collections. They're a unique way of representing our identity and an important way of doing so. And some of the challenges that we have is finding the right person to translate, someone who understands not only the language, but understands what they're talking about within that interview, what they're referring to, lost in translation issues. There's need for multiple translations because we need dialect to Italian and English, Italian to English. Some dialects we can't translate, legacies issues. Multilingual nuance. Now it's interesting with AI, we can use that for transcriptions now, but they still can't work at that level. The importance of silence. When someone is not speaking about something, this is something else Alessandro Portelli mentioned. It's about the cellar of meaning. That's the depth. The fact that something hasn't been mentioned shows that there's a reason why that hasn't happened. And rewards are quite, as you can see here, are quite a few. And also what we found is that just recently I was told, one of the interviewees, this is from her granddaughter, she told me that before that interview, she was never allowed to speak in her household. She was told she was too stupid, literally, and she was told, keep your mouth shut. And she told me, so the granddaughter told me this after the interview, after so many years, because it's not recorded as part of the interview. And some of our key responsibilities with what we do is also not just preserving these oral histories physically, but also it's the preservation of the language. And we've discovered some of these versions of the dialects no longer exists. So I wanted to thank you very much today for allowing me to be here. I wanted to thank the Diaspora Italiana Congress and MEI, and also, thank you. And importantly, COASIT, because without COASIT we wouldn't exist, because we're not funded by anybody else, so we're very, very lucky to be here, but also it's all the donors and the lenders over the years who've made us what we are today. So thank you very much.
Thank you. We should state that COASIT was the first site of the first conference of Diaspore Italiane, thanks to Ferdinando, Paolo, and Fred. Our next speaker is Joseph Shora, Visualizing Diasporic Intimacies, Snapshots of Italian Migration, Home Visits. Prego.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for being here. My paper today discusses two prominent themes of the conference. How do objects help us understand the everyday lives of people, especially in the museum setting? And who gets to speak for those objects? Who allows those objects to speak to us, to interpret them? Who has that authority? And then, of course, the process of return, and in particular, the political, cultural, and economic aspects of return. So, there you go. Take off my glasses. Works. It's nice when that happens. In the history of the first Italian mass migration, images abound of people in transit from Italy to the United States, at Italian docks, on board steamships, and at Ellis Island and other ports. Such depictions in prints, paintings, films, and most significantly, photographs are the iconographic representations that characterize much of how we visualize transatlantic Italian movement during the Great Migration. Despite this profusion of visual material concerning Italian migrant departure, arrival, and settlement, as well as the scholarly literature about the subject, we know little about the imagery of return migration, including repatriation, home visits, and heritage tourism, which often involve multiple trips and stops along the way. My paper addresses the scholarly lacuna of the visual culture of return migration by examining a cache of family photographs assembled by my paternal granduncle, Nicola "Nick" Sciorra, in 1930 and 1937, and my father, Enrico, in 1957, during their respective return visits to Italy. Their photographs document their travels to the town of Caruncchio in the Abruzzese Apennines, as well as other towns and cities and several touristic sites. The images are largely unremarkable. Mostly they conform to the conventions of snapshot photography in subject matter and style. Yet these photographs raise questions concerning how such pictorial representations illustrate social relations and emergent identities in the context of migrant return. How do these mediated interpretations of diasporic and touristic experiences visualize networks of belonging, obligation, and sentiment? Such information is not immediately evinced from the images themselves, but requires a significant amount of personal and cultural knowledge to decipher it with any degree of accuracy. My analysis of these images as visual culture involves what Julia Adeney-Thomas calls an archaeological strategy of contextualizing and interpreting some of the larger meanings in both their production and dissemination. Migration, especially for Italians, has never been unidirectional, but has always been a process of transnational circularity of people, objects, and ideas. Scholars understand VFR tourism, that is, visiting friends and relatives, as a critical part of the larger migrant experience that reveals a diasporic realm of kinship ties, intense emotions, and hybrid identities at the intersection of the local and the global. These images reconcile memories of these two migrants' affiliations with place, reimagine their changing sense of self in relation to a distant homeland, and craft a visual culture that perpetuates affecting links to the future. And the figure in the sunglasses is someone you might see again as we move forward. So, creating a photographic archive in the diaspora. The very existence of these historical images is predicated on Italian cultural values that motivated Nick and Enrico to voyage home. Loretta Baldassar has observed that post-World War II Italian Australians' return visits to Italy involved three key principles relevant to the Sciorra photographic collection: campanalismo, that is the attachment to local place; sistemazione, the urge to establish oneself financially and start a family; and finally, the commitments and responsibilities to family members that include home visits. Nick's and Enrico's images of home visits are directly connected to their intricate migration histories and mutual obligations as family members that developed over decades. Their respective set of photographs survive owing to a web of transatlantic travel and familial duty. Enrico's father, Joseph, accompanied his 18-year-old brother Nicola's migration in 1920, cementing a strong bond between the two. And as Nick once told me, he was like a father to me. He took care of me. Nick, in turn, encouraged and ultimately facilitated his nephew Enrico's migration in 1952. And finally, Enrico took in his aging widower uncle, as well as his personal items, including the photographs, into his home, and along with my mother, Anna, cared for him until he died at age 90. Later, I would conserve and contextualize these historical documents, realizing their importance not only as family heirlooms, but as objects of 20th century Italian migration. My preservationist and curatorial actions are in keeping with a moral sense of familial obligation. Nick's and Enrico's home visits were part and parcel of the Sciorra family's history of transatlantic travel for more than half a century. My family's migration experiences involving 4 generations crisscrossing the Atlantic, first to Argentina and later to the United States, involving multiple trips as well as repatriation, fit a common pattern of Italian mobilities. Acknowledging their multi-generational and multi-directional migration is crucial for contextualizing Nick's and Enrico's return visits and the images that they created. In May 1930, the then unmarried Nick returned to Italy as a naturalized U.S. citizen. World politics disrupted his 6-month stay when rumors of war between Italy and Yugoslavia began circulating and the fascist regime mobilized recruits. Fearing he might be drafted, Nick left Caruncchio abruptly, sailing back to New York just 20 days after arriving in Italy. In 1937, Nick traveled one last time to Italy with his wife Irene after his brother Joseph's death the previous year, staying for 5 months. While born in New York City, Enrico and his family repatriated to Carunchio when he was 4 years old, where he was raised. After the war, Enrico attended the University of Naples, graduated in veterinary medicine in 1951, and unable to make a living in Carunchio, he left for New York the following year and moved in with his Uncle Nick and Aunt Irene in Manhattan, securing a job as a veterinarian with the United States Department of Agriculture. In 1954, he married Anna, who had migrated 4 years earlier from Maranola, a hamlet of Formia in the region of Lazio. I know. But still, I worry. The Sciorra photograph collection is a testimony to the true migrant sistemazione, success in having secured jobs, creating a home and family, and establishing themselves in the United States. The photographs are products of ethnic consumerism before and after World War II that embody the cultural values of Italian diasporic lives. Enrico took great care to organize, index, and annotate the 284 slides from the 1957 trip, which in their deep Kodachrome colors are for the most part properly exposed, well-framed, and visually legible. Nick's images, on the other hand, consist of 10 black and white prints, 2 from 1930 and 8 from 1937. All of the latter photographs were originally glued into and subsequently cut out of a photo album. In addition, there are 59 unprinted negatives from the 1930 and 1937 trips. Many of the images show motion blur or under or overexposed, and frequently images are off-centered with people cut off. So, campanalismo, as you all know, stemming from the Italian word for bell tower, is a topographically grounded and emotionally charged sensibility and identity that operates prominently within the Italian diaspora. For Italian migrants, this place-centered sentiment constantly evolves, and home visits are part of a negotiation and reformulation of individual and ethnic identities. Campanalismo's visual allure and powerful influence is evident with Enrico's first photographs of Italy, which are of Carunchio from afar, its surrounding valley, and even the town's campanile. This early placement in the collection contextualizes the images of family and townspeople to follow. And I have to note that my father kept a photograph of Carunchio on his nightstand and on the dashboard of his car, which meant that he woke up every day to Carunchio, and he was constantly driving towards Carunchio. And on his deathbed, one of the things that he gave me was a print of the town. The camera does not merely document the emotional event, but by its presence also confirms its significance. The home visit's exceptional nature warrants a camera, an inherent element in the visit that marks its distinctiveness from everyday life. The presence of the camera and the photographer are a significant catalyst of events, and this is most evident in various posed stances. Azrelia Arzole suggests that the event of photography, as distinct from the photographed event, does not merely document a specific moment or the photographer's omnipotence, but rather points to a situation in which no one is the sole authority. The symbiotic visual event happens when social relations and mutual obligations existing between those who left and those who stayed are first created as an event of photography and then rendered into a tangible object for future display, reflection, and narration. Excuse me. Thank you. The sentimental hometown connection is fundamentally linked to the bonds of affection for and obligations to family. Family-based campanalismo is visually manifested in the large number of portraits of relatives in the Sciorra collection. The Carunchio images depict intimate family scenes with smiling friends and townspeople grouped together and touching each other, posing for the camera. Some images bring together family from both sides of the Atlantic to highlight the bonds of affiliation and love. Children, the new family members not fully known to the photographers and their U.S. relatives and future audience, are given special attention in both sets of images. They are used as props, in a sense, to simulate and reinforce overseas bonds when they are brought together, for example, to awkwardly kiss or embrace. These choreographies between the photographer, the subject, and those outside the frame are scenarios for transatlantic affection that are revisited with each subsequent viewing. The migrant's return was often timed to coincide with rites of passage, such as birth, a marriage, or death. Enrico turned his camera 4 times to his cousin's newborn son. 10 photographs were taken of cousins' wedding receptions. Nick's 1937 visit was prompted by the death of his older brother, and the images of relatives dressed in black are noticeably more somber than those that were made 7 years earlier. The fact that Nick visited and photographed the burial site of another brother, Umberto, a repatriated migrant and a World War I soldier in the northern Veneto region, reveals the power of familial commitment involving both the living and the dead. Nick and Enrico did more than visit family in Caruncchio. They also traveled to noteworthy tourist locales around Italy. These larger migrant journeys linked Caruncchio and New York City with the Amalfi Coast, with Pompeii, with Venice, as part of an ever-shifting notion of Italianness. Migrant tourism, as Sabine Marshall notes, is, quote, instrumental in negotiating one's sense of belonging, identity, and self-construction, end of quote. Nick's and Enrico's photograph travels map their changing senses of self, no longer bound by a Caruncchio, New York City campanalismo, but tied to a more capacious and national cosmopolitan Italianità. The touristic enactment combined local intimacies and national locales of cultural capital to refashion and reinforce their emergent Italian and American selves. The images show once needy migrants, now successful, with sufficient economic stability to engage in leisurely travel and document it. Home visits and return tourism points to the way in which consumerism, as Simone Cinotto has suggested, were significant in shaping of the diasporic identities of Italians in America. These diasporic tours and the visual documents offered returning migrants opportunities to reimagine their relationship to the country of their childhood and their adopted homeland. And due to the limited time today, I won't discuss here how these photographs reproduced a series of conventional images of the Italian landscape, replete with Roman ruins, Renaissance buildings, an assortment of churches and monuments, which conform to a large degree to an American tourist's view of Italy. But what I suggest in a soon-to-be published article, they also visualize specifically Italian ethnic sensibilities as well as Roman Catholic affiliations. So looking at a church like this maybe look like it's just a significant historical building, but their ties to their own religiosity or emerge from some of the images that are depicted. I love this image, but I'm not going to be talking about this one. But it's iconic and illustrative of this next section. Amid the slide trays of Enrico's images made outside of Caruncchio, there are 2 startling photographs that disrupt the repetition of scenic vistas and historical buildings. This is one of them. These images of unknown Italians render the local picturesque, replicating and perpetuating a visual othering. Dean McConnell characterizes sightseeing as, quote, a ritual performed to the differentiations of society, end of quote. The tourist attraction to peoples and places signify an authenticity that establishes a distancing of the viewer from people deemed economically, culturally, and politically different. The tourist's exoticizing gaze searches for local color to confirm a desired unique experience, and the photograph offers a truth marker, validating the encounter with the real, quote unquote. For the visiting urban Italian American, such experiences and reproductions confirm and enhance the photographer's position as modern cosmopolitans distanced from their former selves. One of the images is a portrait of two boys posing in a congested cityscape. The tray is marked as being from Naples. This singular snapshot out of a series of near peopleless touristic landscapes depicts a classic Neapolitan type, that of the Scunizzi, the street urchin, a subject of local color and plebeian street scenes long established in paintings, photography, and film. It serves as a cultural marker, an authenticization of uniqueness of place, situating the photographer's presence in a specific milieu. No preceding or following image provides context for this photographic moment. The image suggests Enrico's position as an Italian/American tourist, one with the means to travel through an Italy still contending with the war's after effects. Now, while Nick's 1937 collection does not exhibit the intentional featuring of strangers outside of Corunchio, a visual othering is evident in his depictions of some family members. One striking example is this image of 9 girls, several identified as relatives, standing around an outdoor table who temporarily, stopping their work, peer at the camera. The image has an ethnographic quality to it, as if documenting a quaint rural practice. Like Enrico's image of Scunizzi, it is an emblem of a pre-modern Italy, one remembered from the returning migrant's recent past, but no longer part of his urban American self. The most intriguing of the picturesque images are 2 of Anna in her hometown, a former and current self portrayed in a single photograph. In a full-bodied portrait, Anna stands erect with a decorated terracotta jug balanced on her head. What is arresting is her attire, a short-sleeved white dress with polka dots, a double-strand bead necklace with matching earrings, and open-toe, high-heeled mule shoes. She stands on cobblestones, a pile of hay, and an olive tree behind her. Anna's urbane elegance amidst her hometown's rural setting suggests a fashion photo shoot, an enacted display of male fantasy by Enrico. But her splayed fingers pressed against the jug's base reveals her familiarity with the work of transporting water, muscle memory called back into action in the snapshot's stage performance, knowledge not erased after 7 years abroad. In conclusion, writing on diasporic visual culture, Nicholas Mirzoff says migrant subjectivities emerge not solely in the engagement with the past, but, quote, in the creation of multiple diaspora futures, futures forged from memory and experience, but not dependent on them, end of quote. Framed in this way, the diasporic images operates continually at a past, present, future intersection. Incipient objects constantly being reinterpreted and remade. Nick's and Enrico's Italian images were created at the crossroads of their Italian past and present lives in the United States. These images were not static. They involved display and narration and constant re-seeing and retelling as they and their makers moved into the future. The photos collectively produced an intervisuality of multiple visual and intellectual associations, as well as bridging multiple temporal and spatial spheres while recalibrating and reimagining migrant selves. These images were not confined to Nick and Enrico, but always involved an expansive audience of family, paesani, friends, neighbors, and sometimes strangers. For the next generation, the images took on different meanings that contributed to knowledge of distant relatives and antecedents, and of Italian life and culture. Over the years, they have been touchstones of conveyed memory, instilling belonging and emotional connection to others beyond our immediate world. The multiple viewings and accompanying narrations contributed to an ethnic awareness, a diasporic sensibility, and subsequent Italian visits. Their influence is evident in my own reclamation of the subject matter for this scholarly inquiry and my renewed interpretation, which is in part an effort to stem the tide of family memory loss and the conceivable abandonment of these cultural objects to flea market piles of curios. For now, these snapshots of return continue to retain historical grounding and familial relevance and make a small but not insignificant contribution to our understanding of Italian mobility and diasporic visual culture. Thank you.
Obviously, we'll take questions after. Our third speaker is Alice Gussoni, and the title of her paper, Mapping the Identity of Agents of Migration, the Case of Sicily and Louisiana, 1865 to 1901.
Hello, thank you. Thank you so much for this opportunity that allows me to share the very first steps of my research, which is, let's see if the slides arrive. Okay, here we are, which is based at the University of Padua at Diaspore, and it is actually a Marie Curie action, Marie Sklodowska-Curie action funded by the European Union. And why am I researching this particular topic? So despite the considerable number of studies on immigration from Sicily during the mass migration period, scholars have focused their attention on mainly on internal factors such as the economic depression, the suppression of the Fasci Siciliani uprisings, whereas other external factors such as the development of the transatlantic transportation, labor recruitment, and the role of agents of migration have received limited attention. So my project, which acronym is SAIL, aims to focus the attention especially on the role of agents of migration in Sicily and labor recruiters in Louisiana between 1865, which marks the end of the US Civil War and also the abolition of slavery, and 1901, which marks the approval of the Italian immigration law, which outlawed independent agents and tied them to a specific navigation company. They became agenti di vettore at that point. So Sicilian, this is what I'm trying to talk about today in this very short presentation. So the Sicily-Louisiana migration flow, let's try to give a little bit of context. So Sicilian migration as a mass phenomenon began only after the turning of the century, peaking in 1906, so later compared to other regional migration flows in Italy, especially from Veneto. If we think about northern migration, Sicilian migration started later, very later in comparison. And we also have a lack, actually we don't have details, so there's a lack of precise data on how many Sicilians reached Louisiana, so we can only estimate a number of migrants, which is in a very big range between 100,000 and 290,000 people. So you see that statistics are very divergent at some point between 1865 and 1924. But if we have a look at one of the very first statistics that we had in Italy, so the one from Leone Carpi, there's an interesting detail from especially 1876. So the statistic says that we have a number of, not a very big number of people leaving from Palermo to the US, but we had 149 people leaving for New Orleans and only 40 for New York. So you see that already in 1876, New Orleans was a prominent destination for Sicilian people. However, Sicilian migration to New Orleans can be dated back to 1865, because in 1865 we had a report from the Italian consul De Luca in New Orleans that he complained about the number of people from Sicily that were reaching the port of New Orleans, and especially he mentioned the arrival of a ship from Palermo, not only one, and then other two were coming, carrying 150 Sicilian peasants and citrus fruits. Why I'm underlining citrus fruits? Because Sicilian peasants were following the citrus route, because, of course, they were importing lemons, especially to Louisiana. But why the consul was complaining about this migration flow? Because he claimed that there were no job opportunities for these people in Louisiana, and so the consul was suggesting to that the minister stopped this kind of ventures and to suggest Sicilian peasants stay in Sicily rather than reaching New Orleans. But this was not the opinion of the other side of the coin. So what happened in Louisiana? On the one hand, the consul thought that there were no job opportunities for the Sicilian peasants, but on the other side, the Louisiana Sugar Planters Association, the owners thought the opposite, because they were facing a shortage of a labor force after the end of the Civil War, and especially after the liberation of the formerly enslaved workers. So after the emancipation of the formerly enslaved black workers in 1965, plantation owners had to look for an alternative source of labor force, and particularly to work in the sugarcane fields. Indeed, in 1866, the Louisiana Bureau of Immigration was founded, and they wanted to promote immigration to the state. And after a series of failures in trying to recruit laborers from China, from Scandinavia, and from Spain, at some point, Sicily was identified as an area that could supply cheap labor force, especially for the existence of these trade routes, of the lemon trade routes, and also because they thought that the climate of Sicily was very similar to the climate of Louisiana. So one reason was, of course, the citrus trade route that was served by steamship companies, by navigation companies. And if we look at the picture, this is a passage from the Daily Picayune, which was a newspaper in Louisiana, one of the most important newspapers. The title says exactly "Fruit and Immigrants from Palermo." So they were bringing lemons, but also people to work in the sugarcane fields. And actually, this migration flow was a seasonal migration flow, because the zuccarata, as the Sicilians described the harvesting of the sugarcane, was carried out between October and January. So the Sicilians were considered as birds of passage and not migrants that were supposed to stay in Louisiana. Actually, we have particularly one work by Scarpacci from 1980 that discussed the labor recruitment in Louisiana, and Scarpacci managed to describe very well the efforts of the Louisiana Sugar Planters Association, the government in general, to recruit migrants and laborers, of course. So this recruitment system was based on three main strategies. The creation of a committee on Italian immigration, which was founded in 1881. The appointment of professional labor recruiters, and one of them was the one that you see in the picture, Vincent Lamantia, who had been a consul in Catania, in Italy, had connections with Italians in the US, and managed to recruit people to work in the sugarcane fields. The third strategy, which is the one that I'm mostly interested in, was that in some cases the Italian immigrants became labor recruiters themselves. We had, Scarpacci described the case of Mistretta, Bernardo Mistretta, who was actually an immigrant who worked in a sugarcane field for 6 months. Then he decided that he was tired of that kind of job. Of course, we cannot blame him. And then he managed to start selling fruits on the plantation and accepted to start recruiting peasants to work in the sugarcane fields. How did he manage to do that? After 1901, he became a navigation company agent, and he managed to buy tickets, send the ticket, the steamship, the navigation company tickets back to Sicily to his brother. His brother was in Corleone, and his brother was actually an immigration agent in Corleone, so he managed to recruit people, send people to Mistretta in Louisiana. Mistretta managed to welcome the immigrants and help them to settle into the plantation. So this system was exactly connecting the work of the immigration agents in Sicily and the labor recruiter in Louisiana. So Scarpacci managed to tell us about what happened in Louisiana. We have a fairly clear picture. Of course, we need to work a little bit more on the sources, on the US sources, but now the gap is precisely on Sicily. We don't know how the system worked in Sicily, and this will be my job for the next 2 years, actually, trying to understand what was going on in Sicily. And how am I trying to do that? Precisely focusing on the immigration agents, so those who worked in Sicily. So looking at the Sicily-Louisiana migration flow only from the perspective of the labor recruitment, if you want a pull factor, if we want to use this terminology, would mean underestimating the complexity of the choices that potential migrants had to navigate. What we can do instead is to focus on a combination of factors. Of course, overpopulation, rural crisis, the inability of urban centers to absorb migration from the countryside, political discontent. Fasci Siciliani, Donna Gabaccia worked on the Fasci Siciliani and migration to Sambuca di Sicilia, from Sambuca di Sicilia. And of course, we can add the role played by immigration agents in managing the migration flow. Why am I saying managing rather than pushing the migration flow? Because agents were often at the center of the political debate on the rising immigration rates from Italy, which was highly polarized into two main factions: those who considered migration as natural and even beneficial for the newly unified Italian state, mainly to solve the overpopulation problem, and those who wanted to control it. But these two opposite positions managed to agree on one largely undisputed point: the idea that there was also an artificial factor, the agents themselves. So the agents were accused to stimulate migration, to push people to migrate, to trick gullible migrants, and trafficking in human flesh. As a consequence, their activities had to be restricted, and we have a series of laws and circolari, so administrative acts, that from 1873 to 1901 regulated and limited the work of agents. And given this picture, given the fact that the agents were so prominently discussed in the Italian laws on immigration, we have to be careful, because we must not make the same mistake that the Italian legislators at the time did in attributing the main cause of the rising migration rates to the role precisely of immigration agents. And this is an attitude that partially resonates with today's populist and xenophobic narratives, which attributes the rising migration rates to the role of people smugglers and believes that it is sufficient to target the smugglers to stop clandestine migration. Nevertheless, it is equally clear that agents were at the core of the political debate and managed the migration process in practice, and it is essential, therefore, to investigate their role to achieve a better understanding of the Sicilian migration of that period. At the same time, it is clear that their methods were often unorthodox, if not fraudulent at all, and one cannot underestimate that several cases of frauds which are documented in archival sources, such as prefettura, questura, and tribunal records. But sometimes these are the only sources that we have illuminating their activities. So what I'm trying to do is to use these sources, which of course document the cases of frauds to migrants, to understand what was going on in Sicily. So to understand how migrants navigated the choices and how information about a land, a very distant land such as Louisiana, a land that in many cases peasants in Sicily had never heard before, how this image was disseminated in Sicily. And so to achieve this goal, it is essential to excavate Italian sources and cross-reference them with the description of agents in the US, which we have from Scarpacci and other sources. And so these are some of the questions that I'm asking myself, and if you want to help me in trying to thank you, to give some answers, you're very welcome to do that. So how did peasants learn about Louisiana and its job opportunities? How were the agencies organized? Where were they based? The network of sub-agents, who were the sub-agents, and what role did they play in the local community? And especially, what was this translational connection between immigration agents in Sicily and labor recruiters in Louisiana? So what am I doing? First of all, I'm looking at archival sources, and the first step is collecting names. So basically, I'm looking at printed sources, such as newspaper, advertisement, businesses, directories, and cross-referencing them with archival sources, such as public security papers from prefettura and questura, mainly in the Archivio di Palermo, Archivio di Stato di Palermo, documenting the legal and illegal activities. From there, from a list of names, which is not particularly telling in itself, so it needs to be enriched with documents, I'm going to expand the research, for example, from Palermo to Naples, because in many cases we had a network of sub-agents based in Palermo, but the main agent was in Naples, so it is also interesting to see how the communication between Palermo and Naples happened. And of course, the third step will be cross-referencing the Italian sources with the US sources. And in the very few minutes that I have, I am going to show you one of the cases that I found in the Questura papers, in the Archivio di Stato di Palermo. This is one of the most interesting cases I've found so far, which is the case of the Cavaliere Antonio Pellegrino. So it's Cavaliere, so a very prominent person in Sicily, which was an agent, an authorized agent, and he had a network of 6 illegal sub-agents. So this Fiorentino, Marchese, Genovese, Lamalfa, Russo, and a certain Michele. We don't even have the surname of this Michele. The document says that they stayed around the area of the Palermo station. They recruited migrants. They reached an agreement with Cavaliere Antonio Pellegrino, and Cavaliere Antonio Pellegrino gave them money for each migrant that they managed to bring him. But the interesting detail here is that Pellegrino gave them 5 lire for each migrant to New York, but 10 for New Orleans. So my question is, why giving them more money to New Orleans? Was there any reward for bringing more people to New Orleans? Was it simply more remunerative to send people to New Orleans. These are all questions that emerge, but this is just to give you an idea of what these kind of documents, which are of course documents regarding a fraud, can tell us about what was going on in Sicily and why this kind of decisions, how the migrants that in some cases were ready to leave for New York, they arrived to the agency and the agent maybe was going to tell him, well, if you go to New Orleans, there are more job opportunities for you, and at the same time they received more money for that. So we need to be careful in analyzing this kind of details. So in conclusion, thanks to the US scholars, we know in detail, in quite good details, the efforts of the Sugar Planters Association and the Louisiana government to attract a labor force, especially Italian labor force, to substitute the formerly enslaved black laborers. We know how this recruitment worked. We know that some Italians were turned themselves from immigrants into labor recruiters. We still don't know what happened in Sicily. I hope to give you some more answers in the next 2 years. But what is important is especially to explore the transnational connection between agents and recruiters to understand and try to reconstruct this multi-faced decision that thousands of peasants in Sicily took to leave their lands. And this was a decision that brought them to settle precisely in Louisiana. So why Louisiana? What happened in Sicily? These are questions that are worth to be answered, possibly. So thank you, and I'm concluding here.
Thank you. So at the next Diaspora Italiane, we'll expect the answers. Good. We have ample time for questions, comments, observations, disagreements, and the like. Somebody hopefully has a microphone that we can. Grazie.
I have a curiosity and a question for Joseph. Were there any home movies in this collection? I don't think you mentioned about that.
I did not.
If you can tell us something about it.
Sorry.
And also, you briefly touched toward the end of your presentation about the circulation of this family archive, and I was wondering if you could tell us something more about the ways and the occasions in which your relatives were if they were showing around within the family and friends, so that the archive was made. The day began with the presentation by Clorinda, whose father's diary was kept almost hidden for most of his life, and I was wondering whether this is the opposite.
Regarding home movies, there are, I think, something like 7 or 8 millimeter footage. There's 2 reels from Italy, from Enrico's 1957 visit. One of the reels had been poorly transferred onto video, and for this work, I put it into a video player, and it immediately got chewed up. It's incredibly expensive to digitize film, so I haven't looked at it. I remember seeing them as a child. I remember seeing all of these slides from Enrico's collection growing up. Of course, incredibly bored with the images when I was a child. I was not familiar with with Nick's images because he didn't move into my family's home until I had already moved out. And I just I got them after he had passed away. The circulation, I remember, sitting, watching these slides with, as I said, family members, with strangers, with neighbors. So they were circulated. I don't know about Nick's circulation and how those photographs were looked at. I do know from one wonderful letter. He was in correspondence with his father during the 1930s and up until the 1950s. There's one passage in which his father says, "Thank you for sending the photographs." And I'm assuming, and they were after the 1937 visit, I can assume that they were images that he took in Carunchio and then made copies and mailed back.
I had a question for Elizabeth Triarico. I would ask some details about Coasit, when he was found and if he was related to the consulate, because maybe I found a sort of correspondent in French, but I don't know if it's the same organization. Thank you.
I'm not 100% certain about the actual creation, but I know there's been links to Italy because still today that we're funded through Italy as well as Australia, so there's connections with that. Coasit in Melbourne was opened in 1968, and there's also Coasit in Sydney and in South Australia and Western Australia as well, so there's branches of it. But ours is the only one that actually has a heritage component to it. The aged care has been the biggest part of that. So it started off by helping the elderly in Australia, mainly because they felt isolated. And there wasn't much support from the Australian government for them as well. A lot of the early migrants who came out actually needed support from the community itself because the Australian government didn't have things set up for them. Plus the language was a barrier too. So they would always go to people from the same region or town to get that support. So we do work closely with the consulate even today because a lot of the work is linked to that, but it's a separate entity. We also have the Istituto di Cultura Italiano, so we work with them, but they're separate entities. So I hope that helps a little bit.
So that's an association that is recognized by Australian law?
Yes, it's recognised in Australia, but set up by Italy, working with Australia. So they set up right at the beginning social workers to work in the community. So we had the very first social worker from an ethnic group working in the community. So we're very quite early in doing that. So they've been working with the Australian government, but separate in a way, if that makes sense. Ferdinando Colorossi is here, who might be able to tell you a bit more about the background.
It's a charitable institution set up under Australian law. It cooperates obviously with the consulate and so on, but there's no legal connection.
It's a not-for-profit.
It's a not-for-profit.
Right.
Not-for-profit.
Yeah. Other questions? Including, could you pass the microphone? Thank you.
This was a fantastic panel. Thank you. I have a question or a comment or something to think about. Something that you said. About the diaspora futures. I mean, I think this is a really important concept because in a sense, it's an organizing concept that allows us to just break out of nostalgia, in a sense. And everybody fits into the idea of diaspora futures. And it opens up a context for looking at those photos. I mean, I have a ton of photos at home. And you sit there and you kind of look at them and you go, okay, but there's something to be done with them. And it has to do with the relationships. I mean, it was sort of the same thing with, when I was with my father's diary. Like, those documents, those photos, those diaries, they are a call to us to act. And things have been lost. They were lost in the past because we didn't do that, because we didn't have a context for doing it. And so I just really appreciate that. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about how you see that and how it can be a framing device, I think. I was telling Anthony earlier that I've seen a real evolution in these conferences. You know, you're really seeing that this is really going somewhere. It is providing us with that framework.
Let me editorialize. Sure. So let me just say this before Joseph answers. There's so much great work that is going on and also can be done. But unfortunately, within the university system, at least in the United States, there's no room for it. There still isn't any room for it. And so that's the one of the struggles and one of the challenges. It's always sort of, you know, in through the back door, the side door, through the basement, whatever. But there aren't programs, except for maybe one or two. And one would be sort of part-time NYU's Tiro Assegno professorship, and the other would be Florida Atlantic University, where Ilaria Serra and Manuele Petener allow it within the PhD program for comparative studies. Okay, sorry.
Yeah, I found the idea very appealing as well. How do we break out of this kind of nostalgic mode, the celebratory mode? They came, they struggled, they did well. You know, I'm one who's particularly tired of that narrative. So I think for me, that was actually came to that idea at the very end of my writing. I was just trying to make sense of what was going on. And I'll say that it was, while I was familiar with the images of my father, I was not familiar with those of his uncle. It was good to have a certain distance from them, because I felt like I was able to look at them a little bit more objectively. One way that one can go with such a project is to speak a little bit more personally, what these images meant to me, what does that mean going forward? That's what I was trying to suggest at the end. It's not a kind of style of writing that I'm comfortable with, but I like the way in which, and the images from my brother's house, that he has taken this one image, and in fact, all 4 siblings have that one image of Nick's Pompeii in our house for one reason or the other. The idea that these things have a life beyond when they were taken, when they were originally used, quote unquote, originally used, and that they can constantly be reinterpreted, reformulated in different ways. And I think that how it brings us into the future, how we use it, as I said in the very beginning, who has the authority to speak for this? How do they use or misuse the power to interpret and allow these objects to speak, I think is a sort of responsibility that we need to be mindful of. Thank you for your question.
Small comment on this. I think that this is the very big difference between Immigration Museum and Emigration Museum. One of the big differences, of course, is that it stays in objects. Objects which are completely useless in Italy, and as this museum shows, because you don't need to show a suitcase, an Italian suitcase in Italy, but they get precious objects when they go, they travel with the people. So with these photos, it's exactly the same with the vase.
Yes.
And I like the image of it. Was that your mother?
Yes.
Ah, beautiful.
Yeah.
She's really beautiful. She's putting a hand on the vase, an Italian woman who had never done that, you know?
Right.
So that's a step forward.
Yeah.
So, but my real question is to Alice, and it's that why did you choose the subject of this subject? Because I know your studies on anti-fascism, on Salveminism, and so on.
Yes.
And how come you got
Yes.
into this?
Long story short is after I finished my PhD in Oxford, I studied Salvemini, the exile of Gaetano Salvemini in the UK. I wanted to focus on mobility from another perspective. So what I tried was to, you have to find a research gap, and my research gap started from Donna Gabaccia's work. I started looking at Donna Gabaccia's work and her work on Sambuca di Sicilia. And with Guido Bonsaver, who was my supervisor at the time, we developed this project on Sicilian migration, starting from the role of agents, immigration agents. And so our source of inspiration was, on the one hand, Donna Gabaccia with her work on Sicily, and Emilio Franzina and his work, and Piero Brunello that we mentioned earlier, on their work on immigration agents from the Veneto. So we thought, why do we know a lot or enough, let's say, on immigration agents in Veneto, and we don't know anything on what was going on in Sicily? So we tried to understand this particular aspect, and we published a chapter on this together. And then, mentors sometimes are very generous, and then he told me, now you go, and this is your project, you did a lot of work, and it's your time to develop this project. And I was so lucky to work now with Stefano Lucconi in Padua, that he accepted to carry out this project that in UK was not so fortunate, but with the European Union and in Italy especially, got was more lucky, let's say, for the beginning. I'm not, I will tell you about the next few years what's going on, but yes, so far, this is the long story short. So thank you for your question.
If we have some time, just because you asked, I had like an insight when you were speaking about if you give me some motivations about why going away from Sicily. I remember a very good story, which I knew through a documentary film, which is called Sicily Jazz. And this is a story of Dominique La Rocca, yes. Nick La Rocca, which we know as a very famous jazzman. Nevertheless, in time, his fame was a little bit struggling because he was Sicilian. Yes. He was born in New Orleans from Father Girolamo, who was born in Salaparuta, Trapani, and who emigrated in 1880. Now I've looked at it. And what about this idea? Well, Girolamo was a trumpetist. He came from a musician family, and Nick La Rocca was a trumpetist. He became a trumpetist, although his father didn't want to. But in 1919, he got the original Dixieland Jazz Band and the first LP with written jazz in the history. I think that he had many big successes. One was Tiger Rag. We will listen to this till now. And in 1919 or 20, he came to Europe and had absolute triumphal success in tournée. Mm-hmm. Then my question may be, why not music? Because you mentioned the lemon route. But why not the music route?
Yes, that's a very good point. Actually, the first brass bands in Louisiana were inspired by and were so Sicilian participating in them. So in a way, music is a factor. Of course, music is a factor, and again, on jazz music and the origins of jazz music and the contribute of Italians in Louisiana to jazz music is another part of the project. And when I was telling you that this was a part of a bigger project, and then I'm focusing on this aspect on agents, actually we are trying to expand the project into something that looks exactly at cultural history as well. So the sharing of ideas between Sicily and Louisiana from the point of view of music, of literature. And there's another big point, which is, you mentioned, why not music route, citrus route, but also crime route, with Matteo Brera mentioned yesterday. So crime route is another possibility. So the routes were multiples. no roots excludes the others. So we need, this is the point of my project, is exactly trying to reassess Sicilian migration to Louisiana, looking to different perspectives and not only to a push-pull factor, but transnational connection, sharing of ideas, sharing of criminal practices, probably, we cannot deny that, but also positive aspects such as music and culture as well. So thank you very much for your suggestion.
May I add one? May I add? Yeah, I just want to kind of mention this factor of music in Nick LaRocca. Nick LaRocca was a highly complicated person. He was an electrician and a trumpeter. John Gennari, who's a music scholar, recently wrote and published by the Calandra Institute a wonderful, wonderful review of Nick LaRocca's place in a highly racialized city like New Orleans and the privileges of whiteness of Nick LaRocca and his incredibly racist statements later on in life. And another person who was important to the study is Ruth Brayburn, that is really critical for understanding the racialized component of not just the Sicilians and Italians, but also Jews in the creation and relationship to African American music that we know today as jazz. I needed to say that.
And just a footnote, in 1966, Jose Rimanelli published a novel, Una Posizione Sociale, and in it, it's about his grandfather who goes to New Orleans. And there was actually, in the original version, an LP included with jazz music that Jose had actually written, both the music and the lyrics.
I have a question also to Alice, but I think it's a comment general in two parts. One, I'm fascinated by the fact that you went to research the silence, so what's not known. And it's so important to do that because you are looking at it, there's a dynamic in the place of departure, the place of origin, the intermediary. So all stories of migration have this complexity. We know more about some, less about others, and the dangers that we end up stereotyping, and then discrimination comes on the back of that. So the work that you're doing is so important. I would love to see how it goes, but just to say that would be lovely if museums could work more with the kind of, in partnership with the kind of research that you do. And I would definitely encourage you to try that. And it also raises the question in terms of diaspora futures and hearing your personal accounts and also the return to Italy, because I experienced that as in terms of family, the need to go back and all the relatives in Italy that I have no idea who they are, but they know who I am. But then I wonder, what's the dynamics also for those who want to return to Italy today, after 3 generations, 2 generations? Is there a research about that? So is that a pattern? And then how is that playing out? And how are the returnees fitting in? Are they not? So what happens in those dynamics? So I think these are all stories that are interesting for us to think about the circularity, right? It comes and goes, it's object, it's people. But I think it's in looking at the silences and the futures and those things that haven't happened that we can understand stereotyping and try to break the romanticization we're talking about and prepare, right, to oppose discrimination. And from our own experience, the experience of Italianness around that, learn about other experiences of migration and discrimination. So very, very nice.
Can I say something? I agree with that 100%. It's about the silences. It's when people don't say anything at all. And I noticed that with our oral histories, the early ones, there's a lot of trauma because it's all about leaving because of war or poverty or famine, or, you know, they didn't want to go and they were forced and they came to a place they weren't, you know, comfortable with. A lot of the new migration, there is some trauma in that with people leaving, but it's different. And so that's why I was talking about trust, having the right people asking the right questions and delving into the histories and looking at those spaces that weren't filled by documentation and asking, because we're humans, so we've got all of these mixtures of stories. But it is an interesting way of doing it. And as you were saying too, about who interprets these stories, because they're seen from different ways, aren't they? And people see them from their own perspectives. So that they're interesting questions, and that's why all of us working together, as you're saying, museums, universities, that's how we get to the nitty-gritty of all this. This is what I believe. And also working with the community. By having that holistic approach, I think that's where we're going to get all of these answers and even more questions probably.
Because what museums can do is amplify the work that you're doing, right? All the research and the personal stories, and allow other people to then comment because they visit. So I think that collaboration would be very important.
So, did you have a... Quickly.
I just want to wish you good luck.
Microphone.
Sorry. I'd like you to know there is a very dangerous activity that you would try to start, digging up the financial gain of in Sicily.
Let me on Elizabeth's comment about trauma and violence, because that's the other issue that comes up. Let me just recommend one wonderful American novel, mid-20th century American novel, The Fortunate Pilgrim by Mario Puzo. Not Italian-American, American novel, Mario Puzo. Please, so we have 3 more sessions tomorrow, so get some sleep tonight so you can come mentally prepared. Let us thank our 3 speakers, and buon proseguimento e buon appetito.
Grazie molte.